Welcome to the Hanley Effect, a podcast by the Hanley Foundation designed to educate, change minds, and save lives. Our goal is to inspire you, showcase our innovations, and change the conversation about addiction and mental health. Join us as we unravel stories of resilience, recovery, and hope.
Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Hanley Effect. I'm John Dyben.
I'm Rachel Docekal.
How you doing, Dr. D?
Hey, Dr. D, how are you?
I'm actually pretty well. I've been looking forward to this because I've been thinking about this word that keeps coming up. People are talking a lot about it. I get asked questions about it. The word is resiliency or resilient.
Yep.
Are you hearing this? Like everybody wants to talk about it.
I am hearing it everywhere.
I asked a group, a treatment team, what is that word? What does it mean? And it's interesting. Everybody's got some different definitions and thoughts about it, but lots of people are talking about it. So today we have got Dr. Chu Peralta, who is a psychologist and an expert in resiliency. Welcome, Doctor. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you guys for having me.
Our pleasure. We're very excited to hear about what you're doing because this is something that is really a lot of your career is in this, looking at this phenomenon. So what we'd love to know is can you talk to us a little bit today about resiliency and what it means? Why are people talking about it so much right now? But also we'd really love to get to know you, to know what you do and anything about your journey that got you to where you are today that you'd be willing to share.
Amazing. Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. Okay, again, thank you for having me. And you are absolutely right. I think the term resilience and resiliency, they both kind of really took off maybe about a decade ago. Prior to that, I'm not sure that it was necessarily as popular. But I think one of the biggest reasons why it probably took off within the research world, at least, is because it is so difficult to measure. It is not something as simple as let me just take a blood test and see how much, whatever your level of resiliency is in your blood, that doesn't exist, right? So as the research continued to try to find some way to measure it, I think what they really started to begin to see is, wait a minute, we have some subjects in these testing experiments that we have where they really do kind of bounce back quicker from certain stressors that they experience versus other people who are perhaps not bouncing back as quickly. And what I mean by bounce back is, are there some people who are developing trauma responses after they've experienced an adverse life event versus other people who might have experienced the same situation, but not necessarily developing those same trauma responses? And I think that sort of like lit up this light bulb for researchers to see, well, what are some contributing factors that are protecting some people from developing these trauma responses versus other people who are not developing these trauma responses? And one of those protective factors that they were able to identify is this concept of resiliency. And basically what that means is, how much capacity do I have sort of internally within me to be able to respond in a more effective and in a healthier way whenever I do experience some type of stressor, which then also led them to see sort of like the second half to resiliency of, wait a minute, some of these people have it inherently, but then can we actually build resiliency? And so then the later research started to say, wait a minute, actually you can build resiliency in people. And one of the most beautiful and effective ways that you can do that is by allowing your children to be able to go through what's called life experiments, which is basically just natural life, right? So if a kid falls and bumps their head, are we immediately going and like sweeping them off the ground and helping them stand back up? Or are we letting, maybe just like a couple seconds pass by and see whether or not that child figures out on their own how to stand back up from having fallen, right? So if we allow them to go through that life experiment, they then build their sense of resiliency. So long story short, that's essentially how resiliency is seen, I think, in the research, but also how it applies to the real world. So how I got into being so interested in it is really I don't think that it was like an immediate interest in it. I think I kind of just tripped and fell into
Mhm.
discovering the research as I was in the world of trauma. Right. So think like way back when, doctorate program first started, my first case that was assigned to me was a trauma case. And it was this little sweet, adorable kid who had unfortunately gone through a very adverse life event, significant adverse life event. And I started to learn more about that child's background to really, start to understand that child from a more comprehensive lens, but also to be able to connect with that child, just like on a human level of like, hey, how do we relate within this room outside of what was done to you? And I started to hear a lot of my own family's history in this child. And I was like, wait a minute, actually, we relate on so many more levels than you'll ever be able to comprehend because you're so teeny tiny still. You really don't, understand the complexities of the world yet. So I think that's really where the trauma world kind of pulled me in. And then naturally, you want to really be able to understand, like, how can I help people really heal, long term healing? And so resiliency was a factor that just really stuck. And it's still here. And hence why I ended up, whenever I ended up opening up this center, I said, well, it's got to be the Center for Resiliency because this is what we're here for, to help people really build that concept, that skill.
It's so interesting that it started from this the background working with trauma. Everybody has heard of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, but very few people know that there's post-traumatic growth.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that? And how do you help people within your center? How would you help them develop that post-traumatic growth?
Yeah. So think about post traumatic stress disorder as these are the trauma responses that my body and my brain developed because it was feeling very overwhelmed by the life stressor, by the trauma that I was exposed to. And so those symptoms that I have developed that are of PTSD, I'm feeling those symptoms can sometimes make me feel very stuck in life. And when I start to incorporate other resources into my life, I am then able to start to grow from my life experiences and not feel so stuck anymore by these symptoms that I had or that I have. So that's really where what the growth starts to look like. And what engenders that growth is really what are those resources that you start to incorporate in your life? And one of the, I think, most effective ones is this sense of agency, this sense of, my gosh, those symptoms actually don't get to keep me stuck here. I feel very stuck in the mud with them. However, regardless of what messages I've been sent throughout my life, I do actually get to choose to make changes and to be that catalyst of change in my life. So that's really where you start to see the growth and growth spurts happen after trauma, which is really beautiful. And one of I think the not so simplest ways to help that growth happen, but is definitely a more universal skill that we try to teach everyone who comes to our center that has experienced some form of adverse life event is really being able to identify what are some generational patterns, whether they are of behaviors or if they're lifestyles or if they're messages or beliefs or traditions that have held you stuck in wherever you're at, and how do you break those patterns so that you can then start to move forward.
So
So that
that's interesting. So are you seeing generational trauma response pass on, I guess, even though subsequent generations did not have the original trauma?
Yes, absolutely. And so there is this beautiful research out there, thank goodness, that really like opened up our eyes to this concept of intergenerational transmission of trauma. And I fully credit Frank Putnam because he is definitely the one that's the researcher that really put this on the map for all of us. And so what he did was that he followed three different generation of women. The first, so think grandma, mom, and child. And grandma went through some adverse life event, whether they were, the products of were involved in war or were sexually abused themselves. So some adverse life event. And obviously in that generation, mental health awareness didn't even exist, forgot about
Right.
it. I don't even think mental health was like a word that would come or a concept that would regularly come out of anybody's mouth, right?
Right.
So no awareness, we have no treatment for it, right? No awareness, we have no compassion for it. No awareness, we have then us very much so stuck in these trauma responses that we've developed in response to whatever stressor we've gone through. So that's grandma's generation. She's now developed these trauma responses that manifest in all different realms of her life. She's now the parent who is perhaps very emotionless or very numb, or she's the parent who is very hyper aroused. And so she is yelling all of the time or on edge all of the time. Or, maybe it's manifesting in her productivity. I'm feeling really low motivated. I feel like the world owes me because I've been through so much that I don't feel like doing XYZ. And so we're seeing that the trauma responses manifest in so many different realms of their lives, including parenting. So now what that research showed is that the trauma response transmitted to the next generation, to now mom's generation, both genetically, but also behaviorally. Even though mom's generation wasn't the one that experienced the same exact trauma that grandma's generation did. And so exactly what we observed in grandma's generation of untreated trauma responses, meaning no healing really happened, and it manifests itself in so many different realms of life, it then happened for mom's generation, who also did not receive treatment, which then transmitted on to child's generation.
Wow.
I'm reminded of the story of the woman who got married and cooked a piece of cooked a roast for her spouse the first time ever, and it was a big roast, but she cut off the ends of the roast before she put it in the oven, and did that again and again. Eventually, her spouse said, "Why'd you cut the ends of the roast off?" And she said, "I don't know why. My mom did that." And she asks her mom. Mom says, "I don't know why I did that. Your grandmother did that." Grandmother's still alive, and so they go to grandmother, and grandmother says, "Well, because I only had a wood stove that was this big, and so I would cut off the ends to make it fit, and that's why." So it reminds me of that story because it is things that are adaptive or maladaptive, that are responses from that first generation responses to the trauma. You're saying that gets behaviorally and genetically, and I don't know if you want to talk about some of the interesting. I was a person, my epidemiology hat. I'm like, I don't. Let me see but there's actually some fascinating research indicating that it can be passed genetically. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah.
Genes
To
changing.
put it in
Yeah.
like the simplest way, the reality of it is that trauma does affect your body. And hence why there is that book that exists by Bessel van der Kolk that says the body keeps the score. Because your nervous system does indeed develop a response to the trauma that has occurred, right? But then your nervous system sort of keeps it as a map inside of your body. But guess what? Your body doesn't exist by itself. Your body exists along with its brain, right? With the brain. And so the brain also keeps a map of what responses it has developed to the stressors that has happened in life, right? And so very similarly to how we could, through behavioral responses, change our neural networks, right? We've spoken so much about that in the research. If we're not having any type of behavioral changes, guess what? Then your brain is essentially just solidifying whatever trauma responses it's already developed, right? And that gets encoded into your body as well. And so if we have these specific responses that have now encoded into us, into our body, it's now part of our genetics, and then unfortunately gets passed on, or fortunately, right? If there are modifications, gets passed on to the next generation. So even though I want to say, even though, yes, it is true that this can that trauma can get passed on to the next generation, I also want to highlight, though, that through behavioral modification, we can, and cognitive behavioral therapy and somatic therapy, we can make modifications such that we're breaking that cycle and we're not having to pass it on genetically or behaviorally onto the next generation. So while yes, it's so valuable that that research has, brought to light, oh my goodness, this gets passed on two ways. It's also equally important for us to understand, wait a minute, but there's actually a solution, a solution to this problem. So it doesn't have to be that way.
Love it.
So, is the majority of your work with individuals or do you work with family systems?
Both, both, especially when we have the fortune of working with youth, right? With kids or with teens. It's beautiful for us, like our standard way of operating here is that if we're meeting with a minor, we have to, and we tell the parents, like on their first phone call with them, we have to meet with you every single session. We're meeting with the parents at the end of every single session because the reality is that A, we want to keep you apprised of what it is that we're teaching your kids and here in session. We don't want to keep you out in the dark. But B, also we want you to understand how can you bring these skills to the family? How can you practice them maybe you as well as a parent so that you could also help to modify your child's behavior through your own behavior? It gives us really the opportunity to be able to understand or help the family understand like this is a systemic issue if there is an issue and it's not healthy or helpful for us to just point the finger to one person. So, it's kind of like team mentality. We all got to put in the work to help this one little teeny tiny person out that you just brought into our session. But similarly, we'll also do couples work, obviously with adults. So if they're coming in and they're saying like, "Oh, my partner, they have this such and such issue," and we happen to hear, wait, we actually hear some trauma here as well. We bring that into the session so that both of them can also receive some education on how it is that trauma can also affect relationships or intimacy. So, yeah, we definitely bring it into the room with as many people as we possibly think would be helpful.
So can you, for people who are listening who hear this word trauma, who, if you have adolescent children, everything's a trauma, right?
Everything's traumatic. Yep.
And then you might have that, that World War II great grandparent, and nothing is trauma. How, when people say, what is trauma? How do you define or describe?
Yeah. So I always start off by explaining to them it really is so subjective, right? And the reason why trauma is so subjective is because it has everything to do with how is it that my body can handle and my brain can handle the stressor that I'm presented with in that moment. And so person A and person B might go through the same exact stressor, be exposed to the same exact stressor at the same exact time, but you are probably going to see both of them have different responses. And that is because they might have had different capacities to deal with that stressor that they were presented with. Right. So there's this evidence-based treatment called STARE NST. That's the acronym for it. Right. But they have this beautiful analogy in there where they essentially describe, imagine that there are two houses and they are both along the shoreline and one house is built on stilts and the other house is built on bricks. Right. And the same hurricane hits both of them. Which house do you think is obviously going to be able to sustain that hurricane a little bit better? Obviously the brick house, right? That's that's the whole point of it. But the idea is that the foundation of those houses really represent our internal resources that we have available to us at the time that a stressor comes blowing our way.
So it's kind of when we all have different capacities, and when our stressor exceeds our capacities, that's when we're in a state of trauma. I love
Yeah.
that. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
I go back to that word capacity. It's one of my personal favorite words as a therapist. I think sometimes people have a wrong idea of what therapy is about, which I think all psychotherapy is about increasing capacity. If you're a DBT person, you'll talk about increasing distress tolerance,
Yes.
right? There's a lot of ways to put it, but I love that focus on is not it, you've got compassion and empathy, but at the same time, the goal is not to just stay stuck, but to increase that capacity and to move past that. I love that. Can I ask her a personal
Yeah,
question?
ask away.
Why did you become a psychologist? You clearly love what you do. You
I do.
clearly are passionate about this and really care about it. Why psychologist?
So if I'm being 1,000% transparent, when I was in undergraduate school, I was a Spanish major because Spanish is my native language because my parents speak Spanish. And I thought that that was the easiest major to choose. So I chose Spanish. And then Within the first semester, I was like, I don't think I'm really vibing with this very much. I can't foresee me doing anything really in a career that would feel fulfilling. And I was walking with a good friend at the time on campus, and she's like, I have to go declare my major. Do you want to come with me? And I said, sure. And I said, what are you declaring? And she said, psychology. I said, I think I'm going to switch over to psychology with you. So that's the very truth
Love
about how it first started. But then once I started taking the course, yeah, it's sort of like love at first sight. You just get so excited. You're like, oh my gosh, I never knew what statistics was. And this is amazing. And it all makes sense. It makes such practical sense. And then you get exposed to abnormal psychology. And I think that that's like, honestly, the class that like just it like hooks every single psychology student in
right,
because you're
right.
so in awe of all of these different disorders that exist, right? Obviously, fast forward so many years later, and you're like, wait a minute, actually, we don't need to pathologize everything or over pathologize everything. But nonetheless, that's what hooks us in, right? When we're young. And yeah, and so it's all sort of been that. I mean, it was just by chance that I think I happened to get into it. But then, once like fourth year or third year into undergrad hit, I was like, wait a minute, I really actually what else can I do with this degree? And that's sort of, how you start to explore, oh, wait, there's doctoral programs and well, what could I do with that? So that's kind of how the path that I ended up taking.
I
Love
love
that.
that.
Yeah, that's terrific.
Yeah.
So, and I don't want to,
No,
I'm
no,
not,
it's
okay.
okay. Go ahead.
Sometimes I have to make sure I'm not hogging because I always have lots and lots of questions. But she'll kick me. It's okay if I am. So going back to the center, can you tell us a little bit about your center and what it is that, you know, that people can like, how can we learn more about this if people are interested, your websites and such? But what led you to starting this and what happens there?
Yeah. So that one also a little bit happened by chance, I will say again, and just to be very candid. So I was working at a nonprofit trauma clinic for about like a decade. And then towards the latter end of that decade, maybe in like the last year, I think is when the pandemic hit, everything shut down. All of a sudden, therapy went virtual, which was something brand new for me. I don't think I had ever experienced that before. It was,
Right.
it wasn't even this virtual, it was phone call virtual.
Sure.
Anyway, it was interesting nonetheless to have to adjust to all of that. But I had already had like a very teeny tiny individual solo private practice where I was seeing maybe just like 5 people a week through it. And I was missing a lot of time with family, just like the typical
Mm.
story that you hear from a lot of people who went through the pandemic. And I decided at that point it was time for me to stop traveling so far away to that clinic. And I would just stay with my private practice because it would allow me more time with my kids. Well, shortly into that, as you could imagine, so many people started calling in for trauma therapy because of the
Right.
pandemic, really
Right.
just A, making them develop certain trauma responses to it, or B, exacerbating pre-existing responses that they already had in their systems. And there's only so many cases, obviously, that one person can take. And so I was discussing it with my husband one night and I said, oh my gosh, I'm referring all of these people out. And a lot of them were calling back saying, I'm sorry, nobody will take my case. Can you please take my case? And
Mm.
disheartening when you hear so many people that are finally reaching out for support and only to be turned away because there weren't enough trauma specialists at that time or because people, rightfully so, were just like at their full bandwidth and they just couldn't take on another case, whatever the reason might have been. And so he had said to me, he said, well, you should just open up a group practice. And I had said, I'm not so sure that I have the bandwidth for that, frankly, nor do I even understand what that practically even would look like or mean. But then he kept cajoling and ended up convincing me to. And I spoke with some colleagues that I used to work with, and I had asked them, hey, I trust you. I know that you have worked in trauma, and I know that you're a wonderful clinician. Would you mind coming on board and working with me? And then that's kind of how it grew from there. So everyone here, every clinician here, even though we've expanded our services such that they're not just only for trauma survivors, every clinician that works here has to have foundational trauma training in some type of evidence-based trauma treatment so that they're able to at least conceptualize from a trauma lens, which just really means you're conceptualizing from a very comprehensive lens and understanding that people really are a product of what they've gone through. That's really, really at the core what it means. And you're having compassion and empathy, and boundaries, obviously. But everybody else also happens to have like their own niche in addition to their trauma foundational training. So we have like a couples therapist, we have some family therapists here, we also have a neuropsychologist, we have somebody who specializes in play therapy. So it's really sweet. It's like we try to be able to extend our services to everything that people really need in the community.
That's so beautiful, that organic growth.
It's wonderful. So I have an interesting thought question that I'd love to bounce off of you. One of the things that I hear a lot from maybe colleagues, friends, not necessarily our patients, because I'm not on the clinical end of Hanley, is people have gone through things. It has been traumatic for them, but they talk themselves out of the fact that it actually was
Mm,
trauma. So, for example, when I was young, my parents got divorced. That was extremely traumatic for me. But people get divorced all the time. And
mhm.
for many, many years, I felt like, oh gosh, really that's not something that I should have been affected by. So talk about that a little bit. I'm just thinking about that as you said, people are calling and recognizing that maybe they need some help and, maybe they're not sure why.
You know, the first thing that comes to mind is many or a couple of years ago, I was speaking with a colleague and I had said to them, it would be so lovely if in the mental health field, they were to offer preventative like intakes or preventative services. Because by the time that the majority of people call in, they're sort of like at their wits' end or they're in crisis mode, which means that the symptoms have probably been there interfering with life for some time until something really hit the fan. And then that's like the impetus to call in for services, right? So I think sometimes you're right. We're sort of like, well, I just want to go on with life. I don't want to identify as somebody who has trauma, or I don't want to identify as somebody who needs help, or I don't want to make this into a big deal because I've always been taught to, pull myself up by the bootstraps and just keep moving. Like things don't need to be a big deal, which has its time and place for sure. I'm not completely dismissing that that can be helpful. But at the same time, I think what it could inadvertently do and what it has inadvertently done for a lot of people is for them to be very blind, deaf to what it is that their body and their behaviors and their life has probably been trying to say to them for some time. When you're really when you're struggling at school, if you're really struggling at work, if you're really struggling in your partnership, if you're really struggling with parenting, if you're struggling with like different realms of life or aspects of life, your life and your body are trying to say something to you. Like something's a little off kilter here. Hey, can you kind of like step in and, balance this out? Uh, so I think there's so many different reasons why people might not want to identify as having gone through trauma and or seek out help, which is all understandable. And at the same time, if we could only build that awareness and be okay with it doesn't need, you're not going to be a patient forever. And this doesn't mean that you have now like some chronic disease where there's something absolutely wrong with you, meaning removing the biases, right? Then maybe we could get them in a little bit more preventatively and symptoms won't exacerbate so much and life won't feel so stuck or so heavy to have to deal with.
Love that idea. It's beautiful. What I don't love is that I have to be the bad guy.
I
I'm the
know,
time
I
guy.
know. He's the timer.
And so we are gonna wrap things up, but we like to let our guests have. I want to tell you, by the way, uh, this is I keep going back and forth on whether I'll say this to you, but you've been very transparent, and so I'm going to as well, because this is a huge compliment. I'm a marriage and family therapist, so this is a huge compliment. You remind me of for a psychologist, man, you remind me of a marriage and family therapist. Having that
Thank
systemic,
Yes.
non-pathologizing mindset, and to me, that's a high compliment. So
Well,
thank you so
thank
much.
you. Thank you. And it's necessary in all honesty.
Uh,
we could just spread that around a little bit more, I think there would be less biases against mental health, but it is what it is.
I couldn't agree
Completely
more.
agree. Yep.
We like to let you have the last word. What is it that you would like to leave today with our audience?
I would love for everyone to know that, again, just because you're walking through the door, it doesn't mean you're going to be diagnosed with PTSD. Just because you're telling us that you've been through stressors in life, it doesn't mean we're slapping a label on you. If you're even slightly curious about what therapy even is or could look like, give us a call. Our office manager will happily chat with you to discuss any questions that you might have. Our clinicians will happily chat with you. So if people would like, even if you're slightly curious, go to our website, which is centerforresiliency.com, or you can call our office or even text our office or schedule a call with our office manager. Email us. Honestly, we are open doors, happy to answer any questions before you feel the pressure to commit to anything. You don't have to commit to anything.
I love that.
Wonderful.
Dr. Chu Peralta, thank you so much for being here. Dr. Docekal, as always, lovely and a pleasure.
Dr. D, it was terrific. We really, really, really appreciate you. Thank you.
Listening or watching, we'll see you next time on The Hanley Effect.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us for the Hanley Effect. To learn more about our programs, visit hanleyfoundation.org or call 844-502-4673.